In this video, we're going to continue our input system, and we will be writing the functionality of the input class itself.
Woohoo!
So to get started, the very first thing I'm going to do is address the fact that the input class is going to be static.
Okay.
Now we can turn our attention to some of the fields that are going to be present inside of input. We're going to have just a few things, the first of which is inside of input we will maintain a reference to a map set, and we will say that that is our current map set. So the idea is that the input system looks at one and only one map set of dictionaries at any given time.
Okay.
So we make a static map set, and we'll call it current map set. And you'll note that this is indeed private, so in order to swap out map sets, we'll have to give ourselves a little bit of additional functionality, but we'll address that when we get into the method section.
Sure, well, we need something else to swap into anyway.
Now we're going to put together a couple of events. We've already established that we have an input notice delegate, so we'll put that into action here inside of our input class. We'll define some fields as public and static. We'll also define these fields as events, and they will be of type input notice. Now we'll call the first one input pressed. And then once we have that field put together, we will duplicate it. So we have a second public static event field of type input notice that we will call input release.
So this is basically the same thing we did in the key pressed areas.
And this is exactly the same thing. All of this should look very familiar. Right up to the part where we are going to put an empty anonymous method directly into the event from the get-go, just to make sure that we can immediately turn around and call the event without having any worries of it being empty or null.
Okay.
So we will immediately assign an anonymous method. We'll do that by calling upon delegate, and then we'll establish our method structure, which is simply a single parameter of type input data. Then for our method body, we'll simply have empty brackets, and that takes care of our anonymous method. So we'll grab a copy of this method and assign it to input released as well. And that takes care of our fields. Now we're ready to address the actual functionality of the input class. Beginning with initialize. We'll have a public static void method called initialize, and we will take in no parameters to this method. Inside of initialize, we are going to establish the connections between any of the input devices we may be managing. Since we're looking at this input class as the main router or manager of all of our input, the idea is that inside of whenever we call initialize, we'll establish linkages to the keyboard, to the gamepad, and to any other device which we might be looking for. At the moment, we only have the keyboard, so we'll address only him. So we'll say keyboard input, we'll look for keys, key press and key release. I'll begin with key release.
And again, this should all look very familiar.
Exactly. This is the same thing that we did back in the game class when we were testing the keyboard input system. So if we say plus equals, we'll let Visual Studio note the fact that we have an event. We'll hit tab to drop in the new key notice instance, and then tab again to say that, yes, we're happy with the name keyboard input underscore key release for our actual handler method. Now we'll jump back into initialize and take care of key press. So we have keyboard input dot key press. We'll say plus equals. We'll hit tab to drop in our new event, our new key notice. Tab again to drop in the new method, and now we have keyboard input key press and keyboard input key release.
Nice.
We'll worry about the actual implementation here in just a minute, though I will throw in a quick comment above these to say that this is the keyboard handling section.
Right, because the initialize method, that's going to end up growing as we add more things, like such as keypads and things like
That's right. If we were to make a gamepad device, let's say it had a button press and button release event, we would subscribe to those events inside of initialize, and we'd point that at some more methods that we would write as handlers here in input.
And then have another commented section called gamepad, probably.
All right. So moving on, let's throw in a couple more methods that we'll need. First is change map set. We'll make this public and static. No return, and we will call this change map set, and it will take in a map set parameter. The idea here is that since we cannot access the current map set field from outside the input class, we use change map set as our way of swapping out map sets. And all we're going to do in here is remember into our current map set field that we now need to be using the passed in map set. Alright, one last method that we're going to need is going to be update. We'll make a public static method, void return type, called update. We'll have no parameters on that. And the purpose of update inside of our input class is to simply pass along the update call to any device class that might need update. Meaning, in this case, keyboard input needs to have its update method called in order for it to redo its state scan. And a lot of the other input devices will need to do this exact same thing. So here we'll put a call to keyboard input.update. And in the future, as our supported update devices grow, we'll also put in calls to maybe gamepad input.update.
Sure.
Alright, now that we have all of the methods in place, let's turn our attention back to our event handlers, and let's put the code in place that will be necessary to take in this key that's coming in as a parameter, and look that up and see if there is any input data structure that is assigned to it. So we'll take out, actually let's jump up here to our key press method, we'll take out our temporary exception, and we'll put in a local variable. We'll make an input data variable called input data. And then we'll turn around and we need to do a check. We need to look through our dictionary and see if this key is present in the current map set. As a matter of fact, we're going to be looking into, if we look back to what map set currently has, map set only has a key map dictionary. So really we'll need to look into that key map dictionary.
Okay.
We'll need to look into the key and see, is there an entry for the current key that's being passed in? If there is, then we'll assign the input data value that's contained into this local variable, and then we can make a call to one of our, rather this event.
Okay.
So we've got a series of things that will happen. We have a whole event-based system set up to fire inside of keyboard input. That gets fed into our handler. That gets fed and routed through our dictionary, and that results in the possibility of input press being called.
Okay. Wow,
So it is
it's a nice flow.
It's a nice long series of events, but the idea is that gives us flexibility at each point, and that's where we get the ability to do things like key binding. But since now we know what we're looking for, we need to look into key map, and we need to see if key is present. And if it is present, it would be handy to have it just go ahead and assign. So we'll do that all in one statement by using the dictionary's try get value. So we'll make an if statement, and inside of this if statement, we'll look into our current map set, and then we'll look into key map, and then from key map we will invoke the method try get value. Now try get value, we need to take in the key that we're looking for inside of the dictionary, which is simply the keyboard key that's being pressed in, and then if that is found, it will be passed out into a variable. So we'll feed in that our variable will be out input data.
Gotcha.
And then we can close off our if statement. And
what if it doesn't find it?
If it doesn't find it, then try get value will simply return false, and we'll never get into the if statement.
Okay, so it just doesn't do anything.
And in that case, input data would just remain unassigned. If it is found, the method returns true. We get into here inside of our if statement, and the actual input data value gets assigned out to this variable.
Okay.
So let's see, you'll also notice that IntelliSense is not entirely happy about us directly feeding a key into try get value. The idea here is that this key type has to match exactly the type that's going into our dictionary, which is an integer.
It's an int, right.
So we're passing in a type of keys, we need int. Keys is an enumeration, so it's very easy to convert. We just cast over to int. And we'll get the numerical value of that rather than the name. And then our dictionary assignment is happy.
Okay, cool.
So if this try get value came back as true, then we'll know that the input that this key references will be stored in input data, and we can turn around and pass that to the final output event. And that event is our own input pressed event here inside of the input class.
Yeah, that we made way earlier.
So we'll call input pressed, and we'll say that the input that was pressed is all contained within input data. You can start to see now where input data makes a nice and convenient container, because at this level, we're not worrying about like all of the different stuff, player and everything that might go along with it, data and all that.
So you just send it all and you can cycle through it later.
Exactly. We can bind data earlier and then just pass it through in one single statement. All right, that takes care of key press. Now we need to address key release. In order to do that, I'll copy all of this code as it stands here, and we will drop that directly into keyboard input key release, because we're doing exactly the same thing here. We're passed in a key to say what key was just released. We look that up in the dictionary. If it ends up being present, store it in input data, and then we'll call our input released. So we'll fire off input released event, and then that takes care of notifying whoever is listening to the input class. So with that, a quick review. All we've done here is we've put together initialize, so we're binding up the devices that we may need.
Right.
Map set will allow us to change things out. Update passes along any update calls to our devices. Then we have our device input handlers.
Yeah.
So now everything inside of our input class is set up. Everything builds. We have no syntax errors. So that's going to take care of this video. And in the next video, we'll run through the configuration of our input system.
Cool.